Greetings! In this video I want to talk about the generated role performance breakdown and combat log analytics sheets, how to read them, what information you can get from them, and even a short explanation of the background and how those actually work. So, what you can see right now is a Discord screen. These are examples for the webhook if you set that up. There is a video how to set up the webhook and how to even run those sheets in the first place. I'll link it in the description. So when we click on these sheets, there we go, we are presented with the generated spreadsheets, role performance breakdown, combat log analytics. We'll start with the role performance breakdown, and we can see for each role we have a section just with the role name and one with casts. We'll start with tank for a specific reason, because the first sheet without the casts is about cooldown usage, specific stats you want to examine, engineering, and so on and so on. The first section is stats and miscellaneous. You can see shout uptime on these people. You can see how many of their hits were crits that were done on other targets. This is the entire green section, so outgoing, this is what those players have done either to other players with their heals or enemies with their hits. And this section over here is incoming damage, so specifically interesting for tanks, as you can see right here. And while we start with tanks, you can see how many hits were blocked, dodged, missed, parried, and so on. And yeah, that's very useful to have a quick glance on things that might be off. For example, if we look at casters, it's very interesting to check resists, as these are they should be close to 1%. Anything that is above 2% or even close to 2%, at least if it's done for trash and bosses, I would assume that person does not have a proper, well-rounded gear set that has maximum hit on bosses. So this would give me a first indication. The next section for all roles are the trinkets and the racials. If we go back to casters, actually we can see the active trinkets. Passive trinkets are not included. A lot of them aren't trackable in the combat log, so have in mind if these numbers are low, maybe that person uses a passive trinket. But in any way, if you know how many passive trinkets someone uses, you can see, do they trinket swap between trash rates? Do they use their trinkets properly? All of these numbers in brackets are effective numbers. So about the percentage of how many you could have used, theoretically, if you just use them every 2 minutes, and or if it's on a 2-minute cooldown, and you would have to be in combat every single time. So 100% isn't possible. Anything that is around 50% is already pretty good. Here we see very high numbers, but this is a report of a speedrunning guild, so don't be too harsh on your raiders if your numbers are lower. Same for the trinket, the racial section. And the next one is very interesting, obviously, potions, runes, and so on. Often I get asked, why is this not on the combat log analytics, where you have a buff consumable section? The idea is the consumable list that is tracked on the combat log analytics is from a container that is called combatant info, which is filled at the start of encounters and only then. While everything else you see on all of these sheets is things or casts and yes, even potions count as casts that are used in combat. And it's very important to differentiate that. One is a snapshot at the end of a boss. The other is usage of items during combat. So that's why they are on different parts of the spreadsheets, and as this is cohesive with all of the rest of the role performance breakdown, it's here. Having it on both would just mean more stress for the Warcraft logs server, and we don't want that. Alright, so this is pretty self-explanatory. The next would be damage absorbed. Interesting for your Holy Priest, presumably, though it's just a static number, so power shield here. Yeah, there could be other stuff, wards like Shadow Ward, Fire Ward, and so on. Not too useful in TBC, though, with tier 6 coming in, potentially nature resistance or absorption potions on Bash, Mother Shares, this section becomes more interesting. Next is engineering, also quite self-explanatory. All right. We see this character for the first time. That means average hits per use. That means this specific player used 20 Fel Iron bombs, and with every single Fel Iron bomb, he or she hit 6 targets. So all in all, 120 targets with 20 Fel Iron bombs. This tells you a lot about effective usage of engineering items. Do they use grenades or explosives? Do they use separ charges? Do they use both of them? How many targets do they hit on average? Do they use landmines and Thornling seeds for Vash or other bosses? And what is their total damage done for engineering? The damage absorbed and the damage done with engineering are the only two places within the entirety of these spreadsheets where you see raw numbers done by players. The role performance breakdown specifically is built around the idea that you can't really evaluate someone's performance just on damage done. Maybe their gear is inferior. Maybe in vanilla they had world buffs, just some crit luck or unluck. So here we have total numbers because of the very different engineering tools to make them a bit comparable, and still looking at the number of casts is usually the better option. The next section is very sophisticated. This is avoidable damage taken. And there are some things that are a bit confusing about this. The first and foremost, if you want to see these numbers on a log, take note that this is raw avoidable damage. We don't want to know what damage came through to that player's health pool after shields and it absorbs and so on. We want to see what that player actually got as damage. And then here, this is a dynamic list. It lists the 7 boss abilities that people were hit by the most in order by damage taken. And the orange parts are sections where this player is above, I think, 25. Let's look at it. Yeah, above 25%, or 25% above the average of the other players presented here. So just above the average, 25% above the average of these numbers. And red would be 75? Yeah, 75%. So it gives you on first glance an indication where people really could have avoided a lot of damage. And these three lines over here are a bit special. You can see all of those have links. The first is damage reflected. Quite easy, though have in mind the actual query is damage done by player to player. And then I do some filtering. If we look at it here, for example, a static charge on Vash counts as spell that you do on yourself in logs. So this is avoided. Usually you should only find actually spells that were casted against a spell reflecting target, for example SSC the Serpent Guards, as in this case. The next row is damage done to hostile players. That means while they are mind controlled, they received so much damage from these players. If we look at it again here, we looked for this player here. And if we look at events, this is actually, oh yeah, right. You can't see that as events, unfortunately, but you can hover it. You can see Chain Lightning hit those targets, so they were mind controlled. Chain Lightning hit, it's fine. But there could be other stuff here. And last but not least, Friendly Fire. Friendly Fire means has nothing to do with mind controls. So get mind controls out of your way, out of your head. Damage that you did to other players via usually trash or boss abilities. For example, Seed of Corruption on yourself after a spell reflect, or static charge. While you cannot avoid all the damage done via static charge to other players, it's good to see that that number is somewhat in line. Let's look here. I assume we will see static charge for this player. Ah, okay. Conflag hit that player and some other people, so that counts as the one that is getting hit, dealing damage to the other players around him. So that's Friendly Fire. Alright. This is the total. These are the number of deaths, just to have a short, quick comparison. And this is just the percentage compared to the highest total damage taken in this comparison. This is why you always will see 100, and all these other percentages are relative to that 100 on this sheet. Next section, Avoidable Debuffs. Same principle. Don't get hit by things you don't have to get hit by. Not always you can avoid everything, but here this is okay. So 3 players got hit by the clouds on Kael'thas once. Alright, if you see more, you might have to talk to the player or dive deeper into it. And last but not least, we see interrupted spells and what spells were interrupted by whom. Alright, a lot of info, and this you have 4 times for all the 4 different roles. The sections are the same though, just obviously some names are different. And important to note, there are about 300 more things that are tracked by the spreadsheet. But if for an item or trinket there are no numbers found for any players on this sheet, that line is completely erased from the generated spreadsheet. So don't assume because you don't see an item here it's not tracked. Generally it's tracked. If you see something on your Warcraft logs report that doesn't show up here, please let me know. Alright, and the second part would be the casts, again for every single role. And obviously you can't really compare casts from one class to the other, but there are some things you want to look at. For example, you have uptime of boss debuffs. Again, only bosses, unless it's stated otherwise. So quick glance, okay, 97% recklessness, 96 elements, that's really good, all fine and dandy. What else can you look at here? Obviously, between a class you can compare stuff. Also, by the way, you can scroll down. And the next section is AoE casts. Again, we see this character means how many targets were hit by the AoE casts of this player on average. So that's also good to know. And here we can see a red number in italic and bold. That means this player, or the majority of, in this case, hurricane casts were done with a lower rank than optimal. I know this player used this here to preserve some mana, so there can be still situations where you want to do that, but in theory it's still suboptimal and then it's flagged red. These spreadsheets caught a lot of people using lower ranks, especially characters moving from vanilla to TBC. So that's always a thing you want to look at. Then you see the active seconds section. It's a bit scuffed. Idea is you multiply all of the casts with their base cast time values, you get a total value, and then it's printed here and is compared to the other players of this role. There are some classes that have a bit higher, lower numbers on average. You have haste that is coming soon, which will obviously not work well with this. But again, it gives a good first indication. If these numbers are really low, you might want to look more into it. And also the last line is, let's say, also a second proof. If this number is low as well, as Warcraft Logs calculates active time very differently than what I do, and explaining that would take too long. Just know it's very different. First number is total and the second number is on trash only, to see if you have some slackers on trash. If that number is way lower than the other one, you know that person is grabbing a lot of coffees on trash. Yeah, but it gives a good idea of what's going on, especially within a class. It's pretty well comparable. Next section and last section of the role performance breakdown are class-specific cooldowns. You always see one number for trash only and bosses only, and then the total one. After the total one, you see again the effective percentage, so how many of the theoretically usable cooldowns did you actually use. So inner focus here is really good. Over 75% of the theoretically possible cooldowns of inner focus were used. Can exceed 100%, as it does here for the innervates I gained, as they come from different or multiple druids, and you can't say, or you don't know if the number of druids is static throughout a fight, so yeah, can exceed 100% here. Again, this is repeated for all 4 roles. And the other things you can read from this is always a bit depending on your guild, on your goals, but uptimes are a big thing. Suboptimal casts are a thing, or actually cast ranks, spell ranks. And just having a feel of what's going on and seeing your radar side to side gives you a very, very good idea. Not to mention, obviously, consumables, engineering. If you're in a speedrunning guild, you will have to examine this for every single run, for every single player. And doing it via just looking at this is a big time saver over doing it on Warcraft Logs. Alright, the next thing is the combat log analytics, so we're done with the role performance breakdown for now. On the CLA, we have 6 different sheets. We'll go by them one by one, and I'll try to be a bit quick, but nonetheless informative. Let me actually quickly hide this one so I can open the sheet where I'm generating things with. All right. So this is the spreadsheet that generates everything with the instructions tab and the API key and so on. And this is the one you would share with your raiders. On the generating spreadsheet, you have a list of bad enchants that are flagged here in yellow, and excluded gear that is mostly Arcane Resistance gear, fishing gear on Lurker as it's snapshotted on at the start of encounter and so on. So that doesn't fill all of these cells. If you want to add any other bad enchants or excluded gear, you can do that, but don't do it in these cells as they are important from a different spreadsheet. You can do it in line 155 or below that. Just enter the ID of the enchant. If you want a specific slot, if it could be in different slots, a name that should be printed, and that's it. You can also see the slot IDs here, and that is how it's done. All right, so getting back to the generated spreadsheet, you have 8 different sections or color codes. Not enchanted items, so these are not enchanted at all. Yellow are the suboptimal enchants we just talked about in the list on the left. Purple is wrong use, which can be different things. For example, slow fall gear on bosses, or undead versus undead items on a non-undead boss. Things like these. Or even a spell hit gem on a warrior would also be flagged in purple. Pink is no gem use, so an empty gem slot. And then the rare, uncommon, and common gem used is depending on your setting over here. If you say it's okay if my raiders only wear common, you could have set it to common on the generated spreadsheet, and then you would not see any uncommon gems highlighted here. In this case, it is set to rare, but no player in here had any green gems used or uncommon gems used. If we look at the public version of this, there's a good example. Here you would have these green ones, and even here a purple one. But obviously this is just for demonstration's sake. Let's go back to our specific generated sheet. Last but not least, in orange we have inactive meta gems and what boss they were inactive on. Here we have a frost resistance tank that couldn't activate it, and here we have a priest that could not activate it in his or her Vash stamina set. But if a player doesn't have this active for the entirety of the raid, and you kill 10 bosses, then you will see it 10 times for every single boss, and probably a quick PM to that player is very imminent. Alright, next is gear listing. As I explained in the other video about how to generate those sheets, this is mostly for exporting sake, so you have an easy time for subsequent analysis of this or importing stuff into other spreadsheets. Buff Consumables, a sheet that started with very few functionalities. Now it's loaded with those. The idea is to detect slackers quite frantically. It will check elixirs, flasks, food buffs, scrolls, weapon enchants, or whatever you can apply to those, and will also flag if you used a suboptimal consumable in that slot. For example, here, this is a lower than rank 5 edgy scroll. This is probably an MP5 flask, which is not optimal for healers. And you see a total score over here, which, and now listen, on melees you often have 0% because that slot is occupied by Wind Fury, as you can also see when hovering here. Always hover the little black triangles. If this is 0, this is not accounted in the total average, as it's assumed this is Wind Fury. If you really have someone in your raid that has a 0 just because he's slacked, there are different issues, but bear in mind it's not actually calculated in this total average score. Alright. Most of the things are self-explanatory nowadays. The last column, by the way, is jewel crafting necks. You know, there are, I think, at least 4 of them get some use. You will see on how many bosses that player had it equipped and when it was active, or rather when it was inactive. So for 5 bosses this player had a jewel crafting neck equipped and active, and on 1 other boss he had it equipped, but it didn't yield any buff to the group. Alright, that should be most of that. Let us know if any consumables are flagged incorrectly as suboptimal in your point of view, or if any consumable in itself isn't tracked, though that's unlikely by now. Nonetheless, the link to the Discord is in the description if you want to let us know about anything, or even suggestions, ideas, new functionalities. Next we have the drums sheet. This lists all of the different drums, how many of those were used by these players, how many players they hit on average. So obviously 5 would be maximum if your entire group stacked. For every single cast of drums you would see a 5.00. With the small range currently in TBC, that's not gonna happen, but it's good to see how many drums were used and how much the group stacked when they were applied to the group. The validate sheet takes the trash requirements for the zone that were detected here. Keep in mind, the Warcraft logs tells the sheets via the API what zone it is in. If you have issues with this, especially moving into tier 6, just consider splitting up your tier 6 and tier 5 reports. Probably always the highest zone will be shown here otherwise, and you will not see anything about SSC TK if you still want to validate that. So all of that aside, idea is Warcraft logs and the community around it determine you have to kill so and so many trash mobs to qualify for a speedrun without skips, or whatever that category name will be at the time you're watching this. But it's, yeah, just checking these rules and seeing if you missed anything. Quite easy overall. And then the fight sheet, very, very useful. You can compare your run from today with the run a week ago, which for example I did here. So this week we had a 1 hour SSC, 1 hour TK. Last week we didn't really push it and both were 20 minutes longer. I have 1 sheet for SSC, 1 for TK, and we can see on Lurker The boss fight itself was exactly 320 as it was the week before. We changed the order of where we started, so the total number is a bit different for a while. Coming to Leo, we already saved 3 minutes total, and but we're way took longer on Leo. We didn't hit him to 50% in the first demon phase this time around. Lord was quicker, and yeah, just in total the numbers add up of in total we were 23 minutes faster. And if you compare this one, the left section, to maybe the number one in the world, you can see exactly in what sections of the dungeon you lost a lot. As SSC is quite fluid with bosses and everything, it could be scuffed. If we look at TK, that should be way more straightforward. Again, tells us killing Alar, we were 45 seconds quicker at that point in total, but the fight took us 19 seconds longer than last week. We were quicker on the other bosses though, and saved a lot of time on each trash section in between. Alright, that is all the functionality I want to highlight today, and to just give you a glimpse of how everything works, and so also that you know how to read the changelog on the Discord for these spreadsheets. This is the configuration spreadsheet. Lots and lots of numbers and characters. A lot of things can be adjusted from outside. This is a global configuration sheet. That means if, for example, someone reports I missed a trinket, I could just add a line here with the ID for the trinket and how long the cooldown is and how long maybe it has a buff attached to it. I add it here, and then on every single row performance breakdown, doesn't matter what version they are in, there will be a new line for these trinkets, and then they are tracked from then on. So it's very powerful. You can see all the classes here and so on. Just bear in mind, this is done by hand. You can also see here all the things that have an asterisk, means lower ranks if more than 50% of those are detected for a specific spell. Then we have the red, bold, italic highlighting. If you see any missing numbers, please report them. If you wonder about any numbers or highlighting, please also let us know about that. We also have sheets for every single speedrun zone with the trash requirements, so if they change, you can also change them here, and they are changed globally, so you don't have to update just because one number changed, as we've seen with SSC after some weeks of phase 2. We have the buff consumables, which all the elixirs, flasks, food buffs are also in here. If they are italic here, that means they are always suboptimal for all classes. Everything else is hard-coded, so warriors shouldn't use max spell power. Food is hard-coded with the sheet. If anything changes regarding class-specific buffs, unfortunately, currently that needs an update of the sheet itself. And here we have the template or the global sheet for the suboptimal enchants we talked about before. If people find out chest 65 mana is actually bis for a specific class in a very weird circumstance, I could delete it here and then it's deleted for everyone. Or if you say, hey, I added some of those below line 145, I think you should add that for everyone. I could edit it here in the end, and then it would also be considered a suboptimal enchant for everyone. I show you this for 2 or 3 reasons. Most importantly, as I swap to the last sheet, please update with every single major number, so 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. I tag everyone on the Discord to inform you, okay, we reached a state where there is a lot of new stuff. You also get a pop-up when you run an old version, please update now. And it's really important that at least if you get that pop-up to update, to use all the new stuff, to all the new functionality. But also to get, so that's reason number 1, please update. Reason number 2 is to give you a feel of what's possible, what's dynamic, what can be adjusted, what needs a lot of change, and what can be done quickly. And last but not least, number 3, an invitation. This is built by me in hundreds and hundreds, very easily exceeding 1,000 hours. And it's made for free, so everyone can work together, make these better with suggestions, spotting bugs or wrong values. I think in 3 occasions I had 2 numbers swapped around, like this for example. It's important, or I want to highlight the invitation. If you see odd things you add manually, things you adjusted, please report them back to the community. So in the best case, we can implement them for everyone and make these sheets better for everyone. All right. Thanks a lot for sticking through until the end. I wish you a lovely day or night or whatever time you're heading into, and hope to see you soon on the Discord.